Welcome, everybody, to the presentation on heart health. My name is Vanessa Henry. I'm a registered dietitian and certified diabetes educator. So today what we're going to be talking about is I'm going to briefly go over the types of cholesterol just as a refresher for you all. And then we'll get into sort of the meat and potatoes of the presentation, which is the dietary factors that impact cholesterol. We'll go through some nutritional label reading because that's always a bit of a challenge. And then we'll finish up by looking at the Mediterranean diet. If you do have any questions, you can also enter them into the chat as well, and hopefully we can get to them at the end. So just as a refresher, in terms of the types of cholesterol, I've been told that you guys have been told the different types. So essentially what we're always looking for is we want to always be looking to lower that LDL cholesterol, so that bad cholesterol, because that is essentially an excess of it can cause an increased risk of plaque buildup in your arteries, which then ultimately leads to heart disease and or heart attack or stroke. What we're looking for from cholesterol for your HDL cholesterol, this is considered your good cholesterol, and essentially we want this one to be high. Okay, so this one can basically help sort of clean out those arteries. So from a diet perspective, we'll be looking at what can actually help you increase that HDL cholesterol. And then finally, we have our triglycerides. So triglycerides are that extra storage form of excess energy. So we'll often see this high if blood sugars have been high for a while, or if you're taking in quite a few calories, especially if they're not sort of the greatest kind of calories, which is coming from more refined products. But the good news about triglycerides is typically they are the most responsive to lifestyle changes. So that's always good news for that one. So what can you do to help? That's always the question, right? So the first thing that we're going to chat about is watching the different kinds of fats. Okay. And the reason why we want to do this is because it can actually help to raise your good cholesterol and can help lower your LDL, so your bad cholesterol. Okay. Now, if you think back to kind of late 90s, mid 2000s, early 2000s, cholesterol in food was sort of that really big piece that we were being told to watch. Slowly over time, that's changed into the types of fats that we're actually eating. And if you want to think about it, they don't directly impact sort of the cholesterol levels in your blood. Think about it more like the types of fats that we eat provide the building blocks for our liver to make either our LDL cholesterol or our HDL cholesterol. Okay, so essentially what we want to do is we want to provide our body more of those good building blocks so that it can create more of that HDL cholesterol and less of that LDL or the bad building blocks to make that LDL cholesterol. So really what we want to be looking at is increasing our choices of unsaturated fats. Okay. And if we think about fats, it's kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly. And our unsaturated fats are the good. So they're often termed like healthy fats. And essentially what these will do is they can not only help raise our HDL, but they can also help to lower the LDL as well as our triglycerides. And within unsaturated fats, this also includes our omega-3 fats, which I'll break down in a little bit. So our food sources of unsaturated fats are going to be coming from things like our olive oil and our vegetable oils. If you want, it can also come from a margarine as well. Nuts and seeds, fatty fish and seafood, as well as avocados. So really, it's more of our plant-based fats is where we're going to be getting those unsaturated fats. Okay. From an omega-3 perspective, so omega-3, There's actually three different kinds of omega-3. And the one that we often hear the most about, especially in terms of heart health, comes from our fatty fish. So those omega-3, EPA and our DHA. Okay, and these are the ones that have been shown to be heart healthy. And you're going to be finding them in things like your mackerel, your herring, trout, tuna, salmon, Arctic char. So they're going to be more of your oily. Sardines are also a great one. I don't have sardines up here. Um, uh, they're going to be the ones that are a little bit more oily, where sort of more of your white fishes like cod and sole, if you've had them, they don't have that kind of same oily taste or texture. They're still great options. You're just not going to find them, they just won't have the same levels of omega-3 in them. Okay. And then the third omega-3 is what we would call our ALA. And this is actually coming from plant-based sources. So that would be things like walnuts, ground flaxseed, chia seed, hemp hearts. So though ALA is beneficial, but it doesn't kind of have the same heart health benefits that the EPA and the DHA have. So in terms of supplements, oftentimes I recommend that you don't sort of go for an omega-3 supplement because taking too much of anything is not always a good thing. So in the case of omega-3, it does act as a natural blood thinner, right? So great if we're having it a couple times a week. However, if we're taking it in large doses, it can interact with any medications that you might be on, especially if you're on blood thinners already. So from that perspective, I don't necessarily recommend the omega-3. If you are taking them, just make sure that you tell your doctors, including the doses that you're taking. So essentially with any omega-3 supplement, if you're taking over 3 grams, um, it's that is not recommended. It's going to have some very strong blood thinning effects. So I would not recommend that. And then if you are looking for sort of a supplement in those kinds of in an omega-3, you do, if you are going to go that route, you do want to make sure that it has the EPA and the DHA. A lot of them out there nowadays are really focused, or a lot of manufacturers have used sort of like flaxseed oil, those types of things. So you're actually getting a higher dose of ALA. So if you're looking at for it to be heart protective, you're not going to get those same benefits if you're taking more of an ALA source. Okay. Doesn't mean your walnuts, your flax seeds, chia seeds, they're not great options by all means. Definitely adding them into your diet on a regular basis will have lots of benefits just from a supplement perspective. If you are doing a supplement, you do want to check the bottle just to make sure that it's not predominantly ALA, because it will still be promoted as an omega-3 supplement. Okay. So then going on to fat. So our good was our unsaturated. Our bad, or ones that we want to watch, are going to be our saturated fats. So these ones will often also be called our unhealthy fats. Doesn't mean we have to completely eliminate them, but it means that we want to choose these less often. And the reason being is because it has been linked to increases in our LDL cholesterol. Okay. Sources of our saturated fats are going to be our red and processed meats. So red meat does, everyone always thinks of something like beef, but it does also include pork. Um, it would also include, if you deer, bison, right? Any of our red meats, that would all count. And it would also include any of the byproducts from that. So things like bacon, sausage, ham, those types of things. Our full fat dairy products are going to be higher in saturated fats. So those are going to be things like our butter, cream, high fat cheeses, ice cream. There are a couple vegetable sources of saturated fats, and those would be coconut oil, palm kernel oil, Typically in the grocery store, you can't go out and buy palm oil or palm kernel oil, but you will find them in a lot of products. So palm oil and palm kernel oil have actually replaced a lot of the trans fats on the market because it's stable at really high temperatures. So you will find if you're looking at a product and you're kind of like, why is there a lot of fat in this? Most likely palm oil is usually a key ingredient in that. And then lard, right? So rule of thumb for a saturated fat is sticky or solid at room temperature. So if you're looking at something and it's sitting out at room temperature, so if you think of fat on the outside of a steak, right, that's sticky and solid at room temperature. If you think of butter sitting at room temperature, right, sticky or solid at room temperature, those are all going to be our saturated fats. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to completely give up everything, but it does mean that you want to be mindful about some of your choices. So a lot of times people will often ask me about butter, right? Butter versus a margarine. Ultimately, that's a personal choice. Um, but let's say you choose to go with butter, which is fine, but you want to be mindful about maybe how you're using the butter. So, for example, if you're having toast with peanut butter and sometimes you put butter on it and then peanut butter, right? Maybe you want to take the butter off. Okay. Or let's say you're having um, eggs and toast, and you like to dip your toast in your eggs, right? In the yolks. The yolks of eggs are saturated fat. So maybe in that instance, you take the butter off your toast, right? So it's not necessarily about giving up everything. It's more about kind of choosing where maybe you can cut back a little bit, where before we were having a little bit more than we intended. Um, The other one, I'm going to go back for a sec. The other one that you really want to be mindful of is cheese. Cheese is what I call a high ticket item. So it offers up a lot of salt, as well as quite a bit of fat. Um, with something like cheese, often what I recommend is try choosing a stronger flavored cheese. So then that way you don't need to use as much. And also be mindful, it's kind of like butter, where you use it, right? So let's say, um, a lot of times we always put cheese on everything, and the question would always be is, can you taste the cheese? Right? It's a really simple question. Um, I always use the example of Subway, right? So when you go to Subway, they always ask you if you want cheese on it, and most people's instincts are to say yes. But the next time I would ask yourself, can you actually taste the cheese that you're putting on there? If the answer is no, then just take it off, right? Because that extra cheese is adding extra calories, extra fat, and extra salt that isn't adding to the flavor whatsoever, right? So those kinds of small changes can actually go a fair ways. Okay, and then trans fats. So these are the ugly. We want to avoid these as much as possible. Nowadays, they're really hard to find on the market. Um, they're really not there quite as much. But ultimately, these not only increase our bad cholesterol and our triglycerides, they also lower our good cholesterol. So, a lot of these where you'll find them is a lot of deep fried foods, especially if it's in shortening. That's where you'll find that. Some processed meats, you want to be mindful of. Commercially baked goods. Is where you might find more. And then foods made with partially hydrogenated oils. Those ones, once again, are a little bit are hard to find nowadays because we have been trans fats have been banned from the market for so long, but they are still out there. So still you still want to read them because labels because you may find them as like a zero point 0.1 or a zero point 0.2 grams on that label. And if that product has any trans fat in them, I would I would suggest looking at an alternative product in that respect. Okay. So I've already talked about a couple strategies for choosing kind of the healthier fat. Um, but looking at choosing leaner meats more often, right? So fish, chicken. With chicken, all the fat lives in the skin, right? So if you can do sort of, if you cook it with the skin on and then eat it with the skin off, right? That way things stay moist. Turkey's also a great option. as well. Limit your red meat intake to 2 to 3 times a week. Um, just be mindful. So technically, a serving of red meat is about 3 to 4 ounces cooked, which is not a lot, right? So if you go and let's say sit down to let's say a 6 or 7 ounce steak, that's actually two of your red meat servings that you're eating all at once. So some suggestions you may want to choose kind of either smaller ones, smaller servings, or maybe you go for something like a beef tenderloin, which is a little bit more of an expensive piece of meat, but usually the portion sizes are a little bit smaller. It's leaner, a little bit more tender. That might be an option. But really kind of watching our portion size can be a big thing. Looking at incorporating some plant-based proteins at least once a week, so maybe like Monday nights, meatless Monday. Um, and what you want to be mindful of if you are doing a vegetarian dish, don't use cheese as your main protein. Okay, so look at some of the other options. So something like tofu, beans, chickpeas, lentils. You could look at some of the meat alternatives, but I would be careful with those because they also have quite a bit of fat, and quite a bit of sodium in them. So like the Beyond Meat burgers, those types of things, I would much rather have you do something like tofu or beans or chickpeas as opposed to, um, and then enjoying an actual beef burger on the occasion when you have it, rather than sort of using a meat alternative, um, because you're not really kind of nutritionally further ahead on that one. Um, so another option could be that you try margarine instead of butter, or like I mentioned before, just reduce the overall amount of butter. So you don't necessarily have to eliminate it, but be mindful about where you're using it. Using olive oil as a primary cooking oil, watching your portion sizes of all fats. Usually we would say the tip of your thumb is kind of a portion size of fat. So if you're using anything like butter, right, tip of your thumb is typically a portion size. Okay, and then looking at choosing low-fat dairy products. So you don't necessarily have to go with a complete skim milk or a 0% yogurt. You could do something like a 1%. That would be perfectly fine. For cheese, that does say less than 2%. That does not exist. That should say 20%. Um, if that doesn't, sometimes with the low-fat cheeses, they do have a rubbery texture. So if that doesn't interest you, that's fine. If you do choose a higher fat cheese, then that's where I would say that you really want to go with your stronger flavored cheeses. So something like a Blue or a Stilton, um, because you cannot eat a large amount of those cheeses, right? The natural strong flavor kind of curbs the portion size, where something like a medium cheddar, you can kind of easily eat a large amount of that because it doesn't have a super strong flavor to it. It's quite easy to kind of overeat on that one. Right, so just a couple tricks with cheeses. Your soft cheeses, so something like a soft mozzarella will actually have less fat, right? So if we think back to that stickier solid at room temperature, so if it's a little bit of a softer cheese, like a goat cheese, something like that, those will naturally have less fat in them than your hard block cheeses, okay? So that covers fats. I know that's a lot of information. Um, Something else that you can do is increase your fiber. Okay, so some of the benefits with increasing your fiber in your diet is it can not only lower your LDL but also your triglycerides. If you have diabetes or are pre-diabetic, can actually help to stabilize your blood sugars, um, and even the microflora within your gut. And it can also help you feel full longer. Okay. Sources of our fiber are going to be things like our fruits and vegetables, our beans, chickpeas, or legumes, whole grains, and then also our flaxseed, chia seeds, psyllium husk. Psyllium husk is something great that you can add into some yogurt if you are having sort of yogurt in the morning. That's a good option as well. Now, one thing about fiber is if you are not eating a lot of fiber right now, do not go out tomorrow and sort of eat the maximum amount or um, kind of really sort of hammer home the fiber piece because you are going to have a very grumpy gut. Okay, what you want to remember is your gut is just like any other muscle, and fiber is the way it works out. So if you are not eating a lot of fiber right now, you want to slowly introduce fiber into your diet. Okay, because if you kind of eat a ton, a whack load of fiber tomorrow, it's going to basically be asking your gut to run a marathon, and it is not going to be very happy with you. Okay. The other piece that you also want to remember about fiber is as you increase your fiber intake, you also want to make sure that you increase your water intake. Fiber pulls water into the gut. So if you are a little on the dehydrated side, then there's not a lot of fiber or water to pull into the gut. Um, Things are going to get stuck. Okay. And you're going to be feeling very, very uncomfortable. So make sure that as you increase your fiber, you also increase your water intake. All right. So a couple tips to increase your fiber intake is you want to look for something that's whole grains. Okay, so rather than just whole wheat, you want to look at products. So if we're looking at breads that say whole grain, because essentially what they've done is they've taken that whole wheat kernel and ground it into the bread. Where if it's something with like whole wheat bread, what they've done is they've taken that grain kernel and they've ground it up and they've pulled out the white enriched part, and they've pulled apart the fiber into two separate entities. And then when they make the bread, they add some of the fiber, so the whole wheat part, back in, but it's not that whole germ. So I do recommend that you look for something that's whole grain that says on the label. Um, Another really easy way to kind of increase your fiber intake is aim for half a plate of vegetables or fruit with your meals. Okay, it's always a good option. Using fruit as a snack or a dessert. If you tend to drink juice, I always recommend fruit over juice, just because fruit is a lot harder to consume the same amount of sugar as it is in juice, right? That fiber is going to fill you up. So for an example, a half a cup of orange juice is the same amount of sugar as a whole navel orange, so one of the larger oranges. Okay. Most of the time we don't just have half a cup of juice, we usually have a cup of juice, right? So that would be um, the equivalent to two oranges. No one's going to sit down at one meal and pack away two of the large oranges, right? That would be quite filling, but it's really easy to drink a cup of juice, right? So and really it's that fiber and that bulk that's going to help keep us full. Okay. And as we approach the colder weather, using things like beans, lentils in soups, stews, or casseroles is a great way is a great way to start to introduce beans if you're not a huge fan of them into your diet without them feeling super overwhelming that you can't necessarily cut out any, or that you need meat. If you need meat at a meal, doing something like a soup that has, or even like a stew or a chili that has some meat, but then adding beans into that can kind of feel like a nice little compromise. Okay, at least to get you started. Um, some other ways that you can increase your fiber is roasting chickpeas. They make a great topping on salads or on snacks. Hummus with veggies, or adding nuts and seeds to cereals, yogurts, or salads are all great ways to increase fiber. And then also looking at maybe doing um, like a quarter cup of nuts or seeds as a snack. Right? Those are all good options that you could do to increase your fiber intake. Okay. Reducing salt. So salt does not directly impact your cholesterol, okay, but it does impact your blood pressure. Okay, and that's a pretty big deal if we're wanting to work towards a heart healthy diet. Okay, because high salt or sodium intake causes us to retain fluid, which then can also cause more swelling, and it can also increase our blood pressure. Okay. Ideally, we want to aim for less than 2,300 milligrams a day. Okay, the ideal is kind of around 15 to 1800 if you want to be really tight. 2300 milligrams of sodium is sort of that general recommendation, but if you have history of heart disease, typically we want to aim for a little bit less than that. And just to give you a little bit of context, 2300 milligrams of sodium is found in about 1 teaspoon of salt. Okay. And typically, where we find most sources of sodium is not what we're adding at the table or in our cooking. It's actually in processed foods. All right. It accounts for about 77% of sort of our overall food in our salt intake, sodium intake. So just to give you kind of an idea, if you were to do something like plain pasta versus pasta, and when it says pasta and sauce, it means like half a can of something like a pre-prepared tomato sauce, right? So pasta noodles naturally don't have a lot of sodium in them, but once we're looking at adding that canned processed sauce into it, it skyrockets quite a bit. Okay, or even if you're doing the pasta and sauce in the can, um, that is also going to be pretty high in sodium, right? Cucumbers, the whole fresh food, very low in sodium, but once all of a sudden we start to pickle it, our sodium intake increases quite a bit. Salmon, fresh salmon is pretty low. Once we add canned salmon, we're a little bit higher. Now, with that, something like canned salmon, canned tuna, I would probably make an exception for because if we think back to sort of those healthy fats, salmon and tuna would be on that list, right? And in the grand scheme of things, if fresh fish right now, as with most food, is really expensive. So doing something like a canned salmon or canned tuna might be your best option because a half a can is actually a serving, right? So with that, if you were to have something like a salmon sandwich, canned salmon sandwich, um, that would be fine. You just want to be mindful about maybe some of the other sodium sources at that meal. So, for example, if I'm doing something like canned salmon sandwich, then and I normally have like a pickle or something, I may omit that pickle, or I want to make sure that at dinner most of my food is whole and fresh, as opposed to using any prepackaged foods, right? That would kind of be sort of the one same thing with canned beans. I wouldn't really stress too much about those options, especially if you're making most of your food from scratch. Okay. Cheese. So I have cheddar cheese on here, and then your more sort of processed like Kraft single slices, they're going to be a little bit higher. Um, or Velveeta cheese sauces, those kinds of things, right? They're going to be much higher in your sodium. If you look at something like a cappuccino or a hot chocolate, once again, even from the powder, they're going to have quite a bit of salt added into it versus just a straight up coffee with some cream and sugar. Okay. And salt can hide in a lot of places. Essentially, if you're looking at the ingredient list, anything with sodium in it is going to impact your blood pressure. So as I mentioned, a lot of your packaged foods, pre-made meals, fast food, some of your vacuum packed meats or meats that say seasoned on them, those have been brined. So if you think to I always use the chicken breasts that you can buy frozen. And like when you cook them up, they don't quite have the same texture as a natural chicken breast. Usually those have been injected with a brine before they've been frozen, which helps them retain all the moisture in them. So when you're looking at meats or frozen meats, do you just want to check to make sure if it says seasoned? Because if it does say seasoned, it's most likely been brined in a sodium solution. Deli meats are going to be high, canned items once again, but then even for something like beans, if you're not a big fan of beans and you're venturing into the world of legumes, I would much rather have you use something like canned beans and rinse them rather than trying to soak your dry beans for the first time, right? That may propose a really big barrier that you feel that you have to soak them before you can use any beans. If it's easier just to use canned, then that would be an option. right? Just rinse it and it would be fine. Um, Items in a brine, kind of already covered that one. Seasonings, so if you were to buy something like a Cajun seasoning, those already have salt added into them. It would be much better for you to buy the straight up spices, so like garlic powder, cumin, chili powder, those types of things, and make your own blends as opposed to buying the prepackaged blends. Okay, canned soups, bouillon cubes, and cheese, which I've already chatted about. So, some additional tips to reduce your salt intake. You want to watch those high processed foods. Um, Ideally, cook most meals from scratch, using foods with little to no added salt. But then, if you're making most foods from scratch, there is a small window to add a little bit of salt for seasoning. Like if you're making your own marinade, those types of things, you can add a little bit of salt into that because you're using mostly fresh ingredients. Where we run into problems is if you're buying um, kind of like a seasoned meat, like we talked about, and then let's say you're using a sidekicks on the side for your side dish. Um, that whole sodium, that whole meal is going to be quite high in sodium. Okay. We're going to talk about food labels. And then also using herbs and spices. So things like lemon is a great way to flavor your food, but also so are vinegars. Vinegars are a great way to sort of increase the flavor, and there's a wide variety. So you can use something like apple cider vinegar, red wine vinegar, white wine vinegar, balsamic, right? Each of them will add different flavor profiles. You can use them to help marinate your meat because you always need an acid in there. Just some really good options where you don't necessarily need to rely on salt to always be adding the flavor. Okay, so something else that we want to watch is reducing our sugar intake. Now, where this comes into play is lowering our triglycerides. So that's really the biggest piece. Other benefits to reducing your sugar intake is it can help with some weight loss, depending on kind of where you're starting and what your diet is starting off at, and it can also help to lower your blood sugars if that's an issue for you. Okay. Um, Too much sugar has been associated with heart disease. So, what we want to do is we really want to focus on consuming sugar that's found naturally in foods and enjoying the natural sweetness in foods as opposed to foods that have added sugars in them. Okay. So, 1 teaspoon of sugar, so about a sugar cube, is about the equivalent to 4 grams of sugar. So just to kind of give some context to that, a half a cup of chocolate milk. So I don't know if you remember those, the small chocolate milk cartons, that is a cup. Okay, so there is 3 teaspoons of sugar, so 3 sugar cubes in that half a carton. So if you had that whole carton, and that's a small one, right, you'd be looking at 6. If you had sort of the larger one, which is I believe 2 cups, 500 mils, you're actually going to be looking at 12 teaspoons of sugar in that. Okay, half a cup of juice I already chatted about. That's about 3 teaspoons of sugar. Um, a regular can of Coke, you're looking at 9. Activia yogurt, you're looking at about, just for one of those little ones, is about 3 teaspoons of sugar. So something like yogurt, it would always be better to choose something like a plain yogurt and then add your own fruit to it. And frozen works just as well in that instance, for that flavor. Okay, or if you're a coffee fan, a double double, a medium is about 7 teaspoons of sugar. Okay. Um, so where we want to look at reducing our sugar. So honey, sugar of all types, but things like honey and maple syrup, everyone always says yes, they are natural, and by all means they are natural and they do have some benefits. But if you're adding them to things, they are added sugars. Okay, so just kind of be mindful. Your body just treats all sugar essentially the same. Sugar is sugar is sugar. Um, so just kind of be mindful of that. Doesn't mean that you can't have it, and it would be a much better option to have something like honey or maple syrup than sort of a white refined sugar. Um, just be mindful, sort of, if you're adding it yourself, which is typically the case in those instances, be mindful about how much you're adding. Okay, so things that kind of are sort of higher ticket items would be things like jam, regular pop, juice, sugary cereals, granola bars, flavored yogurts, right? Those are going to often add quite a punch of sugar, where we're not always necessarily expecting it. So, kind of being mindful of those areas. So, some tips to reduce sugar intake. Um, Try not to add sugar to any food or beverages. Avoiding sugary drinks like pop, juice, regular vitamin water, Gatorade. Once again, watching those processed foods, choosing plain items instead of flavored. So even when it comes to something like cereal, I'm going to pick on Raisin Bran in this instance, right? I would much rather have you have something like plain bran flakes and then add your raisins to it, as opposed to choosing something like Raisin Bran, which is all mixed together, but then they've added additional sugar for flavor. Okay. And then we will take a look at how to read labels for choosing items with less sugar. Okay. Something else that you want to be mindful of is watching your alcohol intake if that's an issue, as it can sort of increase your weight, it can increase your triglycerides, increase your blood pressure. So ultimately, sort of low risk guidelines, 2 drinks or less per week. Okay, and this gives you an idea of sort of what a standard drink is for wine. It's only about 5 ounces, so it's just a little bit over half a cup, which nowadays with the size of wine glasses, you kind of have to be mindful of because it's really easy to fill up like half a bottle in one of those wine cups or wine glasses, depending on your glass. Um, so label reading. This can always be a little daunting if you haven't done it already. And what I would recommend is when you go to start label reading or you go grocery shopping after this, do not try to remake your entire pantry and fridge. It's going to cost you a lot of money, and you're also going to get really frustrated in the process. Um, Rather pick 1 or 2 items, maybe a week or a couple times a month, that you say, hey, I'm going to try something new. I'm going to see what's out there. Take 5, 10 minutes to take a look and see if you can find a healthier option than what you're already purchasing. Right? It'll be much more manageable that way rather than trying to read every label of everything that you pick up, because you'll probably want to just walk away from your cart at some point. So the very first thing that you always want to do is first look at the serving size. Okay, so that is going to determine kind of a little bit of how much math you're going to have to do. Okay, a lot of times you can do two things. So you can either look at the volume or like the number of, for in this instance, the number of crackers that you're allowed to have, or you can compare the weight, because as you can see with this example, we have 9 crackers versus 4 crackers. But if you look at the weight, it gives you a little bit more, it's a little easier to compare those numbers. Okay. Simplest and easiest rule when you're looking at label reading is the percent daily value on the right-hand side. 5% is a little, 15% is a lot. Okay, so for things that aren't so great, so things like our saturated fats and our sodium, obviously we want to be choosing things as close to 5% as possible, where our healthier item or healthier things like our vitamins, we want to be choosing closer to 15%. Okay, and our fiber can kind of fit into that as well. All right, so what we're going to do, so we're going to do an example, because the last slide, it all just lined up way too perfectly. Okay, so here if we start up at the top and we start up at the serving size, so cracker A on the left, 2 crackers versus 7 crackers for cracker B. Okay, but if we look at 14 grams versus 20 grams, right, that tells me automatically cracker B is really small, right? If I get 7 crackers for 20 grams, they're going to be pretty small crackers. Okay. The next thing I want to look at is I want to look at the saturated fat. Okay, so cracker A has 0%, right? So that's kind of what we're looking for, where cracker B has 7%. Okay, and here you'll actually see that this one has 1 gram of trans fat and zero point 0.4 of 7. So that one really sticks out to me like a red flag. Okay. Um, then if we're going down the list, when we look at sodium, we have 4% versus 6%. Okay, in the grand scheme of things, I wouldn't worry too much about 2% difference. Not a significant amount. Um, I would call those pretty even. Okay, and then what we can also go down to is fiber. So if we're using the 5 to 15% rule, so cracker A has 2%, cracker B has 12%. Okay, so if we're kind of comparing those, um, I would probably choose cracker A only because it doesn't have any trans fat. Okay, the fiber is not great on that one, but I'll go over a different rule for fiber as well, but there's no sugar in that one. Okay, where cracker B, the fiber looks pretty good, but it's actually the same amount of sugar in there, and it's got some trans fats. So probably wouldn't choose that one. Okay, the other piece that you want to think about is how many servings are you going to have, right? So I always use the pizza example, the frozen pizza example. Usually the boxes is for 1/4 or 1/6 of the pizza. Nobody eats 1/4 or 1/6 of those pizzas. So what you would have to do is, let's say you ate half, you have to multiply all those numbers by 2. Okay, so in this instance, we'll use cracker A as an example. Let's say I eat 4 crackers instead of 2, right? I would have to go through and multiply all of that by 2, right? So saturated fat is great. It would still stay at 0. Sodium, I want to be a little mindful because now it's creeping up towards 8%, right? And fiber, I would get 4%. Okay. Um, Another quick and easy rule that I like to use for fiber, because the 5 to 15% rule can sometimes be really deceiving when we're looking at fiber. I always like to ask myself, is the fiber higher than the sugar? Right? Because really, when we're choosing any kind of grain product, that's really what we're looking for, right? It's supposed to be a source of fiber. So the fiber should always be higher than the sugar. So when we're looking at, these are cereals, so we have cereal A. Um, so when we look at something like this, if we just use the 5 to 15% rule, right? We have 28%, which is pretty good. The fiber is 7, the sugar is 5. So really, I'm really actually looking at, is the fiber higher than the sugar? In the other one, we have 1 gram of fiber to 10 grams of sugar. Okay, I'm gonna pick on Raisin Bran. If anybody has Raisin Bran in their cupboard, I would suggest you go take a look at that one, because that one can be very deceiving. I used to have it on here, but I don't. So I would always go take a look at that one because sometimes, even though they'll say it's really high fiber, and it can be really high fiber, but fiber doesn't always taste that great, right? So a lot of those cereals will add more sugar to compensate for that. Okay, so just kind of something to keep an eye on. Now, the fiber higher than the sugar rule only works for grain products, right? Because fiber is naturally occurring in grain products. You can't go look at something like yogurt and ask yourself, is the fiber higher than the sugar? Because the answer is going to be no, because there is no naturally occurring fiber in yogurt. It just doesn't exist in dairy unless they've added some kind of fiber into it. Okay. So that's a lot of information that I've all just kind of thrown at you. And the biggest question probably is how do I put it all together? Right? So with that being said, nutrition can get really easily very overwhelming really quick. Okay. So whenever you're feeling super overwhelmed, not sure what to do, what I always say, is follow the balance plate model, or what we call the healthy plate, right? Um, it is essentially the foundation of healthy eating, right? So if we don't have this, this might be the place where you start, right? And in an ideal world, at lunch and dinner, you want to aim for half a plate of vegetables, a 1/4 plate starch, and a 1/4 plate protein. Okay, quick and easy. So some other sources of starches or other examples of starches, I would include your potatoes in here, especially if you're diabetic. That aligns more with sort of the diabetes diet. So that your starches could be anything like bread, buns, couscous, pasta, um, potatoes, sweet potatoes, and if you're diabetic, I also include corn into that, into my starch. Okay, your proteins are going to be anything like your chicken, your fish, your beef, your pork, your legumes, tofu, meat alternatives, those kinds of things. That will be your eggs, would also be in there as well. And then your vegetables are going to be like carrots, broccoli, cauliflower, spinach, rutabaga, squash, all of those types of all vegetables, right? And then oftentimes, for most people, I usually recommend something like a fruit at snack. Okay, so you're actually getting your fruit outside of your meals, um, because that's a nice way to sort of add in some fruit without sort of overwhelming yourself at dinner. Okay, but ultimately, this is the foundation kind of that healthy eating. And whenever you're feeling overwhelmed, just go back to this. Okay. So ultimately, what we kind of want to look at though is we want to look at the Mediterranean diet. And the reason for that is because um, it's shown to have a lot of benefits. So it can reduce your risk of heart disease, help lower blood cholesterol, lower blood pressure, improve blood sugars. And it may also, some early research also shows that it may also reduce your risk for chronic disease, including cancers, metabolic syndrome, dementia, um, obesity, and mental health, right? So it's definitely got a lot of research behind it for sure. Um, and this is kind of a quick and easy Mediterranean pyramid. Okay. And what you want to remember with this type of a diet is it's a lifestyle, right? It's not hard and strict. It's more of a lifestyle in terms of your approach to eating, fitness, those kinds of things. So we'll go through it all, but you're going to see that fruits and vegetables are on the bottom. Okay. Well, first of all, water is actually on the bottom. Um, Water, coffee, tea. I know beverages are really boring, but essentially water is really, it's not fun and exciting. It is sort of the best choice out there for you. Followed by above that, then we have our vegetables and our fruits, and then we have things like our nuts and our seeds, followed by our dairy, and then we have our fish, our seafood, our meat. And then we're going to have things like our potatoes, our grains and starches, and then our sweets up at the top. Okay. So just to compare, because I know that you guys spend a lot of time there on the DASH diet. So essentially, the DASH diet is really ultimately the same as a Mediterranean diet. It just has a greater emphasis on sodium. Okay, so I have these two posters, but you'll notice that a lot of it is very much exactly the same. Okay, um, though it's kind of the biggest difference. Um, And then, so like I mentioned before, you want to remember that it's a lifestyle. Okay, so eating is meant to be social. So eating meals with family and friends when possible helps with satiety, especially when you're not watching it in front of screens, including regular physical activity, watching portion sizes, focusing on fresh and in-season foods, and then ideally cooking whole foods, right, and turning them into something rather than purchasing foods that are already made. Okay. So ideally, what you're looking for is every day looking at whole grains, your fruits, your vegetables, things like your nuts and your seeds, your extra virgin olive oil, and your dairy. Okay, so those are kind of things that you want to choose every day. And just to kind of give you some context, what a portion size looks like. Okay, so a small banana or a half a large banana. Small bananas don't really exist anymore. A medium-sized fruit, when we talk about medium-sized fruits, it's about the size of a tennis ball. So some of those apples out there are pretty large, much larger than a tennis ball, right? So I would probably say that that would be maybe about a serving and a half. If you're doing fresh, frozen, or canned fruit, right? Frozen is just as good as fresh, especially right now as we head into the winter. It's also usually a little bit more economical to do that. Canned fruit can be an option. You just want to try to make sure that you can get it in water. And sometimes that can be tricky because they tend to add sweeteners into the ones in water. So you really have to look hard to see if you can find one without an added sweetener. And then you can also look at dried fruit. But what you want to be mindful of is dried fruit is that it doesn't have added sugar on that. Okay, so what we're looking for is about 3 servings a day of fruit, right? So if you had one at breakfast, and then if you add 2 snacks in throughout the day, that would be your 3 servings if you use them with your snacks. Vegetables, ultimately, you can have as many vegetable servings as you'd like, but in an ideal way, if we're aiming for something, you want to try to aim for 4 servings. So, what does that look like? It's going to be half a cup of raw or cooked vegetables, or a cup of leafy greens. Okay. So, your leafy greens are going to be things like your spinach, um, kale, that type of thing. And then your heavier vegetables, so things like carrots, peppers, those would be a half a cup. Okay, so if you think of like a cup of your heavy vegetables at, let's say, dinner, and then like 2 servings at lunch, that works out perfectly, and you have your 4 servings. Okay, nuts. So a serving of nuts is about a quarter of a cup, or 2 tablespoons of peanut butter or almond butter. Okay. In terms of sort of difference between peanut butter and almond butter, not significant. There is a significant cost difference. So that one is a personal choice in terms of which one you prefer. And if even if you're looking at 1 serving of nuts a day, right? And you can add that with, like, let's say an apple and some nuts, makes a great afternoon snack to kind of tide that hunger over. But that also hits your serving for the day. Okay. Olive oil, ideally you want to be looking to use olive oil for cooking, simmering, and seasoning. So olive oil isn't stable past 400 degrees. So if you're going to be doing anything at high temperatures, you may want to choose a different oil. But if you're doing anything like sauteing or simmering sauces, it's a great option. Or if you're doing something like in salad dressings, um, you can look at using it in replace of butter in some instances. Ideally, what we're looking for is less than a tablespoon of buttercream or like hard margarine. So those don't even really exist on the market where it's like solid. Um, but you can still have things like butter. You just want to be, like I've mentioned before, watching sort of where you're having it and how much you're having. Okay, dairy. We've already kind of covered some of this, but it's also a great source of protein. Yogurt is a great option as a source of protein, especially if you're doing something like a Greek yogurt. Um, and watching kind of those foods that are high in those milk fats. Okay. Choosing weekly, those would be things like our beans, our lentils, fish and seafood, poultry, and eggs. Okay, so our legumes, which we've talked about. So a lot of this stuff in the Mediterranean diet is not new, right? We've already talked a lot about all of the benefits of it. It's just sort of how to incorporate it back into the diet. So these are sort of all of your sources, which we've chatted about. And what is a serving? So 3/4 of a cup. Now, if you're not eating legumes on a regular basis, you may want to start off with like a half a cup, because that is a good dose of fiber. Okay. And ultimately, this is a hard one for a lot of people. You want to be looking at 3 times each week, right? Whether it's sometimes it's on salads, sometimes it could be in something like a curry or a soup or a stew, but trying to kind of increase the fiber in that way. Fish and seafood, which we've talked about, you want to go for 2 to 3 times a week. Um, and a serving is about 3 to 4 ounces, which is about like a half a can of tuna or salmon. Okay. Poultry, which we've also talked about the chicken. So being mindful of watching the skin on the chicken because that's where a lot of the fat lives, but it's an excellent protein source. Um, and it can also be, it doesn't always have to be chicken breasts, which are kind of astronomical right now in terms of cost. It can also be thighs and legs. Just remember that there is a little bit, the darker meat will have a little bit more fiber in there. Okay. Eggs. So eggs are also a great source of protein. There's a lot of controversy around eggs, but ultimately, if you're aiming for about like one egg a day, um, that works out well. So essentially, that's like 6 to 7 eggs a week. Just don't eat them all at once, right? So spreading them out. But hard-boiled eggs, things like that, can make a great snack or breakfast option, which is easy and high in protein. Things that you want to choose in moderation. So are red meats or processed meats, sweets and treats, and alcohol. Okay, so red meat we already chatted about. So your red meats are going to include beef, pork, goat, and lamb. Also deer and bison if you're choosing those options. Keeping your red meat to about 2 times a week. And just remember, it's like a serving is about 3 to 4 ounces cooked. Okay. And then watching our processed meats because they have much more fat and also salt in them. So those kind of really do it a double whammy for you. So being mindful about how much you're having. In an ideal world, according to a Mediterranean diet, we're really limiting that meat to less than once a week, that processed meats. Okay. And then finally, kind of to round it off, I'm going to quickly chat about SMART goals. So always keep in mind setting very specific goals and attainable goals are really important. Okay, so looking at specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-based. So a lot of times when I'm working with clients, they will say, well, I want to eat healthier. Okay, well, what does that mean, right? That doesn't give you a plan forward. Okay, so, um, or they'll say, I want to eat more vegetables, right? But that's really, really vague. So, what exactly are you going to do? So, a good option would be I'm going to fill half my dinner plate with either steamed, frozen vegetables or a garden salad 5 times a week for the next 4 weeks. Okay, it's really specific, it's measurable, and it has a time frame for it. Okay, or I want to eat less meat. Okay, well, how are we going to do that? So this one is I will make a list of my favorite plant-based meals and include them a meatless meal every Monday. Okay. Or if we're doing a blood pressure, I want to monitor my blood pressure. So what does that actually mean? What does that look like for you? I will check my blood pressure 3 times a week before bed. Okay, so by setting really specific examples rather than really general ones, you're going to be a lot more successful, right? Because it's going to give you something really specific and it should be small, right? Don't set a giant goal. Set one goal, accomplish it, and then move on to something else. Okay. Um, Diet is about building sort of those healthier habits, not trying to flip your entire life on its head, because you will be able to manage that for a short period of time. And then something in life is going to come along and it's going to take some of your time and effort. And all of the changes that you made, or you'll slowly go back to the way that you were before. Okay. So just kind of keep that in mind.